Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining this Garrison Institute virtual forum. I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute, and today's session is a conversation on Father Thomas Keating, the making of a modern Christian mystic, with the amazing Cynthia Bourgeault. Before we begin today's session, I'm just going to review a few logistical items for our gathering. We're on a Zoom webinar, and so participant audio and video will be off for the duration of the webinar. That means you guys. So you're going to see us, but we can't see you. But we can read you, so please put any questions you might have into the Q&A box that's in the center, slightly to the right of your Zoom screen, and we'll be monitoring them and try and integrate them towards the end of the conversation. There's also recording of these sessions, and you'll have a chance to review the recordings as well as a schedule of upcoming programs at www.garrisoninstitute.org. Now, I am really, really pleased to introduce our guest today, Dr. Cynthia Bourgeault. The Reverend Dr. Cynthia Bourgeault is an Episcopal priest and writer. She's been a longtime advocate of the meditative practice of centering prayer and has worked closely with fellow teachers and colleagues, including Father Thomas Keating, Bruno Barnhart, Richard Rohr. Bourgeault has actively participated in numerous interspiritual dialogues and events with luminaries and leaders such as A.H. Almas, Kabir Helminski, Swami Atmaramapanda, and Rami Shapiro. She's a member of the Global Peace Initiative for Women, the Contemplative Council, and the recipient of the 2014 Contemplative Voices Award from the Shalom Institute. And she's written a lot of amazing books. She holds fantastic retreats at the Garrison Institute, including one coming up in March. And most importantly for today, she is the writer of this wonderful book, The Making of a Modern Christian Mystic, for the Thomas Keating. It is published by Shambhala Publications. There, trying to get it to be in focus. And I encourage you all to read it because it's an amazing story, not only that is teaching about Father Thomas, but his life story and his intellectual and spiritual journey has a lot of wisdom in it, and it's a fun read too. So Cynthia, welcome.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Good to see you again.
Thank you. For those in the audience, I last saw Cynthia about 4 minutes ago. So, Cynthia, it'd be great for, many of our audiences know a lot about you and some don't know so much about you. So it'd be great to hear your story. If you want, start with how you grew up and then how did you find your vocation?
Wow. Well, that's starting way back in the game. I guess I would say the most important thing about where I grew up is with relevance to what we're going to be talking about today is that I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania in the heart of Quaker country. And back in those parts of the world, Quakers were silent Quakers, which meant that their format for meeting looks like about the closest thing that Christianity had for contemplative silence. You would sit in silence. There was no teaching or preaching per se, but you waited and you gathered until the spirit ceased, and then people would be moved to get up and give short witnesses. But it was for me, a profound immersion in silence as something that actually had heft and content, shape, intimacy. I always kind of knew this. My religious nurture itself was very different. My parents had raised me Christian Science, and it was like night and day. There's about the most diametrically opposite religions you could imagine. But I had this little seed of the Quaker contemplative silence and the seed of silence's presence from about the time I was 4 years old. And so, to make a long, long story short, with many, many twists and turns, seeds that begin with knowing that silence is present somehow will tend to grow. And they're going to be growing under the surface for a long, steady time. So that's what happened with me. My career path took me in college through through English, through language, through literature. but I was always kind of interested in religious studies, spiritual questions, and it eventually dropped me into a teaching career at a local Episcopal seminary where I was also was quickly seized upon as material to become an ordained priest. Back in the days when that was just getting rolling in the Episcopal Church. Anyway, it all sort of wove together, and I spent many, many years of my life sort of writing, teaching, doing mystical theology, and then I began to hear about this thing called centering prayer, and that some Christian monks, some Catholic monks, had developed this thing in Christianity that was really meditation. They called it prayer, but it was meditation, I heard. And they said, well, this sounds interesting. And by that time, I was already spending considerable amounts of times in Catholic monasteries, contemplative monasteries. So in one, I bumped into the name Thomas Keating, uh, and started reading his book. And I suddenly twigged and said, oh, I've heard this name once before. Uh, and went back and looked at one of my favorite of all time books by Jacob Needleman called Lost Christianity, in which he was really asking the question, is there any conscious life left in Christianity?
Hmm.
He was hot on the trail. This was like early 1980s. He was on the trail of any signs of kind of conscious creative intelligence, and he'd gotten wind of Thomas Keating and gone out to the original monastery Thomas was at the time in Spencer, Massachusetts, to watch these monks who were putting together this new meditation practice called the centering prayer. And Jacob wrote approvingly about the courage and the innovation of the monks that were doing it. So the noose began to close on me, little did I know it, when I was by that time writing for Parabola magazine. And Parabola was just coming up on its big 25th anniversary issue. And Parabola, of course, has one of its staunch oars in the water to be an interspiritual forum. And so it was putting together a 25th anniversary issue in which the keynoter was going to be His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a few of comparable stature in some of the other traditions. So they asked me kind of nervously, do you know a Christian that we could put in here? And you could read the subtext. It was a Christian that isn't going to make a complete fool of himself by, in the presence of these, mindful, illumined, enlightened spiritual beings. So kind of out of the blue, recalling what I'd heard about Thomas Keating from Jacob Needleman, and my beginning forays into centering prayer, I said, well, how about Thomas Keating? So I said, great, you go interview him. So off I went to a little retreat center that he had founded in the Hudson Valley, Chrysalis House, with the help of some of his longtime supporters, interviewed him, uh, and he invited me on the spot to come out to the monastery where he was currently in residence, St. Benedict's in Snowmass, Colorado, where they were getting this centering prayer movement really rolling. And they were already doing sort of 8-day centering prayer deep immersion retreats, teaching retreats. So he said, come on out and join one. And I did. And I hadn't been there for more than, the first 2 hours of centering prayer when I realized, oh, I'm right back again to the Quaker meeting of my childhood. This is silence with heft and presence and depth, and people are transforming in its light. So I kind of hung with Thomas Keating, and by that time I already was you know, a somewhat experienced teacher and public performer, being both an academic and a Episcopal priest. So giving retreats and leading sessions was not a problem for me. So I quickly, got credentialed as being a teacher of this movement. But that started my journey with Thomas. And ever since, I found that adding the piece of centering prayer just changed the whole way that I taught, the way I understood, and the way that people could receive what I was teaching. It was like night and day difference. So I became a a groupie, a devotee, a somewhat quizzical student of him, and a challenge for him. Uh, an old patriarchal male, not quite knowing what to do with a woman religious who wasn't a nun, uh, and uh, and that began a 30-year relationship of really good give and take that lasted till clear up to his death in 2018, with his, you know, at the age of 95.
Father Keating was an amazing guy. Um, I met him when Ed Bastian, who was part of Father Keating's Snowmass, or what was it? Was it called the Snowmass group or the
No mass conference, I think.
yeah the Snowmass conference?
Yeah.
And he brought Father Keating and Rami Shapiro and people and Helminski, Kabir Helminski, and others all to the Garrison Institute for an interspiritual event very, very early, just when probably the first months of when the Garrison Institute was formed. And Father Keating was so luminous, we invited him to become one of the spiritual advisors at the Garrison Institute, and then developed a wonderful relationship with him ever since. And uh, just another side note, um, it happens that he was the same age as my father, and they were in the same class at Yale. They came from very different backgrounds. My father was the first person in his family to go to college, and Father Keating came from a long line of people who'd gone to college. And they didn't meet each other then, but it was interesting because I always my father had passed away early, and I always just had this slight just sense of I don't know, of looking to him like a little. He was Father Thomas Keating, but a little bit like a father to me too.
I love
Um,
that. I love
yeah,
that. Yeah. Wow, I didn't know that before.
and
He really did step into your dad's shoes in a way, didn't he, and become your spiritual father.
yeah, and he was so wise and joyful, and he loved the Garrison Institute. And so here he was. He, for those who don't know, he wore monk's robes, and he was a very serious monk, and he lived in a Christian monastery, and all of that. He was a very serious Christian monk. But at the Garrison Institute, in our main chapel, we have in the main meditation room, we have a big golden Buddha. And the Buddha statue, we have curtains that we can close. And so, out of respect for uh, Father Keating, we closed the curtains. And he said, no, no, open the curtains. I want the Buddha behind me. And he often insisted that he be photographed or filmed that way with the Buddha behind him. So he had this tremendous interest in interspirituality, which grew over time. So I'd love you to talk about that.
I love that too, and that's part of one of the reasons why Garrison was so powerful and seminal in his own being and becoming, and that much later in life, one of my friends in the network told me that Thomas had told him, well, centering prayer is my day job, contemplative outreach is my day job, the interspiritual dialogue is my night job. And I haven't been able to really trace how far that went back in him. But I know that even in the 70s, uh, when he was slugging through it as abbot at St. Joseph's Abbot, a very, very formal Cistercian Trappist monastery in Massachusetts, still very much just coming out from under the wraps of that kind of heavy and closed Catholicism. Even then, he was reaching out. He had a TM master come in to teach all the monks to do TM. He had a Zen Roshi come in to work with him on koan work. It's like he kind of understood that something had gotten stuck in the Christian institutional pipeline that the living relationship with silence had uh, dried up in a way, and it was so much transactional prayer and formality, and he was yearning for the living waters, and I never knew him when he didn't have this intuitive sense that it was to be found in a deep sharing with the other religions of the world. And as a matter of fact, the very, very first place they ever held a centering prayer retreat was at the Lama Foundation, which is
Wow.
probably the flagship interspiritual community, residential community in the U.S. Uh, down in Taos, Mexico, where they had already sort of pioneered the path of Sufis and Buddhists and Aboriginal Americans and everybody kind of being together and learning from each other. There in November 1983, the first centering prayer retreat was hosted, the first 10-day immersion retreat. And I think that when Thomas was actually at that atmosphere and breathing in what it was actually like to do deep meditation in the presence of people who were meditating all within their respective traditions, but in a universal and common silence. He Something caught fire in his soul and came together, so that from that moment on, uh, this great interspiritual commitment never was absent from his heart. And it became crucially important to him during the final 30 years of his life, which is the period I really work on my book. Uh, in the beginning, though, he had to be extremely careful because he was in a Catholic tradition. He was an abbot of a Catholic tradition, and and Christianity has a lot of sort of funny little triggers that are oblivious to people that aren't Christians, but they're really powerful triggers to Christians. Like, for example, even the phrase centering prayer was looked upon with horror in a lot of corners of Christianity because they immediately interpret it as navel gazing. And you get a whole lot of commentaries from more conservative Christian elements saying, well, with Christianity, we don't gaze at our own navel. We gaze outward at Jesus and through Mary with joy. You know, and so if you say anything even slightly off the mark, you could be just completely wiped out as an infidel and a heretic. I mean, he could have been silenced at any places along the way. And one of the things that I really came to admire more and more about Thomas as I got to know him better and learned to hold my tongue a little more was just how cagey he was
Mhm.
about being able to manage things so that he could keep steadily pushing the envelope of people's confidence in the living non-dual power of silence without completely alienating the institutional structure in which he served. Ah.
Great. So I just want to expand on this in two ways. So first of all, just for those, the Lama Foundation was I would call it a hippie spiritual center that was built in the mountains of New Mexico. And it is where Ram Dass went in 1969, I think, or maybe early 70, but after his initial trips to India, and wrote Be Here Now. He wrote it on retreat at the Lama Foundation. And so quite amazing for an abbot of a conservative monastery to go there and hold his first retreat. So tell our audience what is centering prayer?
Well, centering prayer is a very simple, no frills form of silent sitting meditation that was developed within the Christian tradition, right at the heart of Catholic Christendom, uh, to basically give Christians an opportunity to get into the game of meditation, if you want to put it that way, uh, without having to become a different religion, primarily Buddhist or Hindu, in order to, and to work with a whole kind of unfamiliar devotional and theological culture. If you want to stay Christian and meditate, it was the way. And the story has it it's a really interesting story that back in those same 60s that saw the founding of Lama, uh, people began showing up at the doorway of his monastery in St. Joseph's in Spencer, Massachusetts, this conservative Catholic monastery, asking for directions to the Insight Meditation Center, which was the newly opened Buddhist meditation community right down the pike. And Thomas got intrigued by these people and actually brought them in for conversation, another remarkable feature of his being. And he'd ask these young hippies with beards and backpacks, well, why are you going to the Insight Meditation Center? And the answer was like, a path, man. We're looking for a
Hmm.
path. And so Thomas discovered that most of them had been raised Christian and a good number of them Catholic. And he says, why aren't you looking for a path in your own tradition? And their jaws dropped. They said, you mean Christianity has a path? And of course, for any good card carrying hippie, a path means a practice based on meditation that actually changes the way you live your life. So Thomas, in frustration, went back to his monks one day in what they call a chapter meeting, a gathering of the monks, and said, is it not possible to put the Christian meditational wisdom into a meditational format suitable for people in the world? Do you have to come and be a constant inmate and do the long literals and devotions and, the complex theology and wear robes and not get married? You have to do that in order to know the heart of the contemplative oneness in Christianity. So one of the monks in his community, Father William Meninger, took him up on this challenge.
Hmm.
Back to a 14th century devotional classic called The Cloud of Unknowing. And in one of the key chapters, chapter 7, it was going on, but not even a lot of words are necessary. If you want, you can take the heart of your naked yearning direct for God and put it into a single word like God or love, and let that word be your shield and buckler as you carry it with you into prayer. So, voila, the essence of the method of centering prayer, a single word that carries your naked intent direct to be God, to be totally present in the silence, to be totally, not filling it up with content, thoughts, plans, theories, you know, uh, just to be quietly and barely present. And the way it works, and Thomas Keating nuanced the prayer over the years and took it more and more in the direction of a real sort of objectless awareness non-dual practice. But the way it works is that in centering prayer, a thought is defined as anything that becomes a focal point for your attention. So, and the goal in centering prayer is to let all thoughts go. Not because thinking is bad, but because the act of releasing your attention from a focal point on something is in itself a way of restoring and symbolizing your consent to live in this open, wordless, uh, intravenous kind of infusion of the silence. And in centering prayer, that's called consenting to the presence and action of God. So you're not driving away thoughts to make your mind a blank so that God can get in the emptiness, but rather you're using this free gesture of releasing your attention from trappedness as a kind of gift. I give back to you, God, my open space, my non-planning, my non-manipulation, my non-figuring it all out. And I do this repeatedly. So if I've had 1,000 thoughts in the prayer time, I've 1,000 times repeated this gesture. Or maybe since most of us sleep through most of them, maybe 5 or 10 times you've remembered, oh, I'm thinking, let it go. But you're actually practicing letting go of your attachment to something inside to make space to stay in bare, objectless, expectant silence. So that's what the prayer is. Uh, and it didn't take too long before Thomas figured out that this was really done on the modeling of what's called in in the New Testament in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, uh, emptying. That there's a wonderful piece of passage from Paul that says, talking about Christ, though his state was that of God, yet he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to, but rather he emptied himself and, assuming the state of a slave, was born in human likeness. It goes on like that. But this whole idea of the path to God is through a self emptying, which is not so much a hollowing yourself out, but a willing making space, letting be so that something else can be. And that was the brilliant insight that he managed to put into this very simple prayer practice of centering prayer. Uh, so you simply sit there quietly for 20 minutes with the intention to be fully, quietly, barely open to the divine presence, beyond thought
And
and words. Yep.
and in Greek, that's called kenosis.
Yeah. Yep. You're right. And to apply kenosis. And so you spend 20 minutes in that. And when thoughts come up, which is in centering prayer seem to be perfectly natural because that's what the mind will do on its default programming. It'll latch on to this thing after another. But that actively uncoupling your mind from whatever thought it's got hooked up on is an expression of both your consent and a deeper consciousness within you that wants to find itself in the silence, not in all the language and manipulations. So that's what you practice and strengthen. And then you carry it out of the prayer into daily life in your gradual realization that that's a pretty good way to live life too. Not by being silent all the time, but to enter new situations by opening, releasing, making space and letting be rather than plowing in and controlling and constricting and insisting. So there's a natural connection between the meditation practice on the inside and the spiritual growth in letting be and surrender and consent, an open-ended curiosity that gets carried through out of it in life. And I think I saw the fruits of that in Thomas Keating over 30 years of journeying with him as he progressively and really quantumly grew from being less and less sort of controlling and dominating and insisting and top-down mental to just, you know, the whole universe breathed through him toward the end.
Hmm. The whole universe breathes through him. That's a pretty good result from emptying.
Yeah,
There's a couple questions that have come in that I want to stick into our discussion before we go
sure.
on. So somebody asked, what does the total transcendence of the self-reflective mechanism of consciousness look like? They're quoting from the book, page 211. And say that again, because I think this really ties to this emptying, the total transcendence of the self-reflective mechanism of consciousness. So what does that
Well,
look like?
that's a huge question, and I would hope to say that it could be a scary question for people that are not wanting to go there yet. And so essentially what it feels like and means, and please don't think that I've mastered this, the best I would own up to is having occasional tastes of it, but I've watched in those that really have. It's the ability to live and to orient in your life and simply be present without this constant sort of dialogue going on between my smaller self and my larger self. How am I doing? What's it all about? This reminds me of this in my past. In other words, you're not constructing yourself at every moment. And on the other side of that, there's a powerful uh, what the Asian traditions are particularly strong in calling a direct perception of reality. an objectless awareness that's both viscerally fresher. I mean, it's like breathing air that isn't stale because it hasn't been recycled through this mechanism that keeps creating yourself. Uh, it's heightened kinesthetically. Uh, it's heightened heartfully. So it's a powerful tool. And toward the end, Thomas was really working that and trying to live in it and actually living in it a good deal
Mm,
of time. Uh, but the important thing that I think Thomas discovered, and that I certainly discovered watching his death, and it's a gratifying thing to discover, is that that little self uh, is actually in its own way beloved and useful. And a lot of people get the idea that you just get rid of the thing and then you're an open window into reality for the rest of the time and you never go back again to the small self again. Well, Thomas proved to the end, as do most people I know who die really beautifully conscious deaths, that the small self still has its pound of flesh at every moment. But Thomas began to see, and Christianity is really good at this when it's on its game, that in the same way that in that original one that I just quoted, that God becomes flesh and then gets confined in a human form and acts like a person and has to call God daddy, uh, there's a beautiful love exchange that goes on between the smaller and the larger, and between the larger and the smaller, you know. And the Western traditions really get this. I mean, the Jewish tradition is superb at this. Uh, so so that the this small self functioning in the world has got some usefulness to God as an expression of the beauty and goodness and ongoing creativity and playfulness of the world. So Thomas began to get onto that toward the end. And some non-dual mystics get lost in the transpersonal and can't get back again. And don't want to get back again because they would feel it's spiritual regression.
mm,
And Thomas learned, and I think that this is the best and the highest of the Western mystical sense, that you can and must pour back and forth between the infinite and the finite, and that the real beauty of God and the love and the magic and the play of God is expressed in this mutual pouring. So he learned that the real goal is not to destroy the smaller self, that vicarious ego self altogether, but to allow it to not have to carry the weight of your identity. So his identity was transformed and transposed more into the infinite. He didn't need his self to keep telling him how good he was and how fine he was and how safe he was. He was perfectly willing to live without all of those things. But he could tenderly look upon the little self as a connection to uh, uh, to the world of people that he loved. And he could also, when he stood in this little self, he could look up at God, whom he called Father, till the end of his life, and uh, and say, "Father, I love you. Father, I help." Some of his very last words were in the abandonment prayer of Jean-Pierre de Caussade, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." That that intense tenderness that can only really be fully expressed in a relational field between a father and a son or a lover and a beloved. Uh, and that this gives not only some delight to God, that's an anthropomorphic way of saying it, it is a full and valid expression of the infinite capacities that are within divine beingness. And I think that as he came to understand that, his his radiance just grew and grew and grew, and his compassion towards people grew and grew and grew. He saw that we're all stuck in this same sort of mutual pouring, and that there's something perfect about that, and that we just got to return to our perspective. And people would stand in his room, and it was feeling like being standing under a fire hose. He didn't even have to say anything. They just knew that they've been bathed in love.
That's been fantastic. We have some questions that have come in. The first one I think you've answered, but somebody asks, is no self an aim of the Christian contemplative path?
I would say no. I would say that it is not prohibited to go to that state. Uh, and although the people that do that tend to get frowned on. I mean, they're few and
Hmm.
far between. They're like the Meister Eckharts, and most prominently on their own time, the Bernadette Roberts. Uh, but but that and that it's a very, very important state to to access if you can stand it, and if you don't get uh, if you don't get completely undone and confused by it. Uh, but that where the tradition goes and where Thomas takes us in his last poem is you go through that. And what that confers upon you is a clarity that can't be undone. I mean, you really have seen through all the defenses, all the all the games, all the ploys, uh, you know, and then you come back and you consent to live in the finite form for the the glory of the manifestation of that sparkle of joy that comes in God when that happens. So you consent to your own form. You take up your cross and follow again. Uh, so and I think it's very interesting that I've just shared some personal correspondence in the past couple of days with somebody who knew Bernadette Roberts very well, and and she confessed to him that she did not think that this was the usual or normal or even desired endpoint of the Christian journey. It sort of is a very important scenic detour for those called toward it and a very, very useful stage in the final culmination. But it's not the end. That may be slightly different in emphasis than in some of the other traditions. But I think even in the Buddhist tradition, where these categories are much more profoundly explored and more accurately, because Christianity is sort of new at the game of exploring
Hmm.
the transpersonal states, the no self states. But even there, uh, there's extraordinary high regard for the bodhisattva position, the one who while having attained the uh, full enlightenment that would allow for the complete release from continuance in any kind of form, uh, elects to stay present so that all sentient beings can be upheld and saved. So in other words, one steps aside and consents uh, for the glory and for the betterment of all. And even in the Buddhist path, this is looked upon as a particularly high and noble spiritual uh, vocation. And I would say that in the Christian tradition, it tends to be the whole thing. It tends to be the highest. Uh, so that, and that's again because of the incarnational thrust of Christianity, the sense that God so loved the world. Uh, and And my own take, Jonathan, is that what Christianity really needs, I think its insights have been right all along. But what it needs is a much stronger phenomenology that can flesh this out and doesn't get trapped in pitting it in an either or. You either do this or you either all, enlightened, you're alone, it always wants to make things into this damn argument and prove that the Christian who, who chooses to serve has got to be the better person. And that's a trivialization of,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
yep,
I want to build on that because Keating, towards the end of his life, became very committed to non-duality and to seeing new non-duality from multiple points of view.
yeah,
And he used to do what I call non-duality jam sessions.
Yeah,
Um, and had people like Rabbi Zalman Schachter, and they would sit in silence and like go to their highest realms and
yeah,
kind of share that space together, and then talk about it in a language that I think only they understood amongst each other.
yeah. It was a wonderful flow, just a beautiful flow. And from all I can see, still still my best take on the spiritual journey is that it's like a tree, and the higher the branches grow, the deeper the roots have to be.
Hmm.
And so the more you can sustain, the non-dual states, the deeper your roots need to be in humanity, in compassion. And if the growth that we're seeing in this tree is of a deepening and joyful presence and engagement with humanity and compassion, something is going very right in the vision. And then you can go as lofty and as high and as transpersonal as you want because it's all God. But if it's making you weird, if it's making you arrogant, if it's making you unable to participate in the simple, sturdy goodness of the finite condition, uh, then something's gotten a little unbalanced in this tree and it may be at risk of toppling over.
Hmm. That's an amazing analogy, the roots and the branches. Um, in Buddhism, often they say that wisdom and compassion, think of them as two sides of a page. So you
Hmm.
can't separate them, or the two birds of a wing, that wisdom and compassion are integrated. One person said earlier when you were talking about centering prayer, you said she thought she heard you say that you should be barely present. And what did you mean by barely?
Barely present means present in bareness, not hardly present. It means, and to be present bare, it's sort of like a tree in the winter. Uh, you see the sharp outline of the branch. There's not a lot of leaves and things muffling around in it. That it and contemplatives have always tended to use the word bare presence in that way. So what all the branches and muffling and summer growth are is basically our egoic self, always talking, always wondering how it's doing, always wondering if it's enjoying things or if it's safe or, you know, in other words, it's all good in its own way, but it's just leaves that disguises the simple, stark presence of the branch against the winter sun. And
Hmm.
and if you can take that as a kind of an analogy, that's what we're talking about in centering prayer. And the the contemplative mystics have always prized this kind of a practice. It takes the whole of your collected attention to be there, so it's not half-assed, uh, but it doesn't drain off any energy whatever into emotional reaction, story, or self-narrative. It just listens, like Wallace Stevens, the snowman, you know.
It is awareness.
Yeah.
Another question is, what's the role of the body in grounding oneself during centering prayer?
Oh, that is a marvelous question. And I think this is one of the places where we're seeing the signs of the time and the change of culture even from Thomas's era. Thomas always taught that the job of, in centering prayer is to make the body neutral. I think we're beginning to learn more and more in a new age that's much more sensitive to embodiment and the inner motion of prayer and circulation and the inner circulation of life currents in the body, uh, that the body is not neutral. The body is the active locale where the infinite meets the finite in us, and that it serves. And I would say that the body in centering prayer for a normal person who doesn't have back pains or things like that, the same posture that you're in to meditate is the posture you're in to sing, you know, fairly straight in the back, chest open, the head centered, not looking up at God or scrunched down, freely flowing. And you can feel if you're sensitized, you sense in that a balance. You can actually sense the life forces flowing within the container of your body. Uh, and and when you do centering prayer with that kind of groundedness in your being, uh, not only do you stay awake better, but it becomes in a wonderful kind of quiet way a sensuously embodied experience. You know that your body is participating, and you know that your body is being nourished by this. And it's a wonderful sense that if you're just going around trying to make the body neutral, you don't know how much it's being nourished or how much it's supporting your effort of your own, more subtle bodies to nourish themselves in the infinite. You know, I love, Eckhart Tolle with his new normal, usual sense says, nobody gets enlightened outside of the body. And he can say in 10 words what it takes someone like me 100 to say. But that's basically it. What you think you're going to go get enlightened floating around in the air, with your disappeared out of yourself? No, it's right here and now in the four square corner container of our body that anything infinite happens.
Um, Another question. Can you center in prayer and step outside of the small self without a longed for but thwarted belief in an encounter with a supreme being, Father or God? So, can you center in prayer and step out of the small self without a longing for or encounter with a larger self?
Well, there's a couple of dimensions in that question, and I'm not quite sure which one is the most important to the asker, so I'll try to deal with this one. Uh, I would say that uh, longing is always a factor in our spiritual journey. Uh, is the is essentially the final propellant. But our longing, thank God, is not always under our conscious control. Uh, Sometimes we just long, and very often we tend to get stuck and trip ourselves up by trying to make our longing over articulate. And then we move into imagination and fantasy. So I long for God, and then now all of a sudden you've created a story. Uh, the fact of the matter is, I remind myself as I sit down from centering prayer, sometime thinking, this is the last thing I want to do today, damn it, And there I sit anyway. That longing can sometimes be something very much quieter than just this great emotional symphony. It can be that quiet thing that sets you down. It's like that little guy in the Dunkin' Donuts ad, time to make the donuts. But there's something that holds you there. And I believe it's in everybody, and you don't need to hype it because it's there. So I'd say trust the longing. But the second point is that when you try and make it too articulate, you may wind up uh, kind of shifting the balance and falling in love with the creations of your imagination, falling in love with your experience. I want to have the experience of God. I long for the direct experience of God. And then your imagination is off and running. Thomas says at the end, as he becomes more and more as a hard boiled contemplative, the deepest experience of God is no experience. And this is a really, really hard teaching because one of the major ways we use ourself, and as a huge energy consumer, is as the holder of our own experience. I am the experiencer of my experience. So I want to have the experience of having my longing for God met. And so
Hmm.
what do, I wind up going into the prayer with this emotional expectation, this theological story about who God is. And if I get any of that gratified, then I go, oh, I've had an experience of God, And and Thomas is saying, and that same thing we talked about with bare awareness, this increasing movement toward the non-dual cuts right through that. Because what non-dual means, in the shortest of shorthands, is the experience yourself shuts up. And you don't get to savor the experience of your own experience. Uh, it just is straight on. So, yes, you are always entering the field of this larger, compassionate intelligence, which you can experience as palpably meeting you, or you can quote, quote, sense as palpably meeting you. But you may not, and you probably will not, as your contemplation increases, experiences that as an emotional high, you won't experience it with any kind of emotional charge attached to it whatsoever. It will transpose itself into a deep feelingfulness that just uh, expresses itself most in that sense of I'm awake, I'm here, I'm present. Uh, Thomas says we wake up. We don't know to what, but we know it's there, it's sweet, it's infinite. I wish I could had confidence that I could go directly to the book and pull it out. It's an absolutely beautiful final statement from his book, From the Mind to the Heart, one of his last works, that just talks about bare presence uh, beyond the experience of having a wonderful experience of bare presence. As you know you're there. But there isn't any of this kind of stuff that any of this kind of drama that we insist of laying on it in the West. So we think nothing's happened, but something
So,
knows better.
but this bare awareness,
Yeah.
so whether you define it as God or not, there is an awareness, or I'll turn this as a question, but isn't there an awareness of the universe, of a
Uh,
much bigger, or not big is the wrong word, an all pervading consciousness?
I would say yes and no. I mean, at the end, Thomas Thomas was beginning to really push the envelope here. He says to me, that even in the transforming union, you're still aware, that there's you and there's God. Uh, and I think the problem with these sort of way out, farthest out states, which is what we're just discussing there, is that they really exceed the capacity of language. Uh,
Mm.
that there is an awareness that's not an awareness of, and and it doesn't allow itself to admit of any kind of interpretive lens to be put on it, like awareness of the universe or awareness of the cosmos or where. I mean, it won't play the game of letting itself be trumped by a higher awareness of. It just sort of throws you back on yourself. Uh, it's just pure awareness, as they say. And it's at that point, Thomas was really, really hanging out there, I would say, for the last 10 years of his life, as he began to discover that silence was itself an encounter. It wasn't the backdrop for an encounter, as he tended to teach in his earlier teaching. It was itself the whole account, filled with, you know, the medium was the message. It was the fullness of what was transmitted in it. And he was perfectly fine with that because he knew that what was transmitted in it was of a scale of aliveness beyond anything that words could even point to.
That is a way to end this conversation. Fantastic, Cynthia. Thank you so much. There's a lot of depth in what you said, and it took us on a wonderful journey. I really, really appreciate it.
Right. And Jonathan, I would like to take this time to thank you and to thank Garrison. uh, for your beautiful and pioneering support of Thomas Keating in the beginning and his ongoing work and of this conference and this seminar. It's a marvelous tribute to your own prophetic belief that uh, from the resources that are implicit in the contemplative path, that we can and will emerge to co-create a more civilized and decent and compassionate world.
Yes. And by the way, one more plug for the book, because at the very end of the book, you describe how Father Keating had been long suffering and had been in a semi-coma for quite some time, all of a sudden sat up in his bed
Yeah,
and gave a message to the world. We don't have time to go do it now, but it's in the book, a message to the world of enormous clarity about what contemplative wisdom could bring to world peace and order, and then became silent.
yeah. It was brilliant. It was almost like though he was at Spencer by that time. He was in the infirmary. He was less than 2 weeks before his death, and he was spending long, long periods of time at that point between the worlds, sort of. And comatose isn't the right word, but drifting. And he emerged sharply and delivered this little oracle that its contents are not really different from anything that any other bodhisattva would say. Love the world, pay attention to peace, to harmony, to stop making war. He says nations are passe. He says this warring for turf is out. We need to begin with a world that is with one world. This beautiful uh, message, which we'll really explore in our final panel of making one world, that we have to behave as one world. And he spoke from that, but it was almost like he was there already. And he was sending back to us these final instructions for, get your act together and get the planet together. Love one another, grow up, uh, get over being fascinated by the stories and the lies and the intrigue, and let's build the world that reflects divine love, divine intelligence.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you for joining us to build the world that reflects divine love. Is that what you just said, Cynthia?
And intelligence.
All right. Um, Reminder that our virtual forums are offered free of charge, but we love it when people want to support us. So please go to the Garrison Institute website and click donate. And anything you do, we donate, we would be very grateful for. Also, there's a calendar of not only our upcoming programs, but also you can see posts of the previous talks that we've had. The most recent one, I think, was the one on moral economy. We see you many times in the future, and thank you all for joining us today.